Angus, thank you for being here.
First, I want to say what an honor and a privilege it is to be amongst this amazing group of teachers. But a real honor and a privilege to be here to support Shannon. Shannon, you are such a beautiful light. What an amazing soul. And I will never forget working together on the Soul Centered series in Santa Monica. We did that 2 years running. And the first year, we had someone else who was running the AV, and we were in a very old, rickety old building that had appalling electronics, a terrible electrical system, which was fraught with all kinds of difficulty, and it proved to be fairly stressful. And yet, Shannon, you showed up, and you were just a complete battery of love, and that energy was infectious, and it certainly helped me. It helped me feel very grounded in terms of how we handled those those electrical challenges. I know at that point in time is when you got your cancer diagnosis. So how incredible that you were still able to maintain that battery and show up in the way that you do. You're such a hero to me. So I just want you to really know that. And again, what a privilege to be able to be here today and support you. So anyway, it's funny, I was sitting on the couch with Rohini, and realizing that I'm about to speak. And quite often when I find myself in a situation where I have to speak in public or teach or coach, I find myself getting a little bit nervous. And I had this realization not so long ago. Actually, when I say not so long ago, literally 10 minutes ago, or insight, if you like, that my ego really doesn't like public speaking. My ego sometimes doesn't even like coaching. But that part of me that's wise really loves it. That part of me that's wise is kind of singing inside of me. Wow, this is an opportunity to get really present. This is an opportunity to play this game of life and hold its hands and dance with it. And so for me, when I can hold on to that realization or that insight, it makes it so much easier. But having said that, I still find that those nerves come up from time to time. But when I look at the title of this event, Awakening the Wisdom Within, and the relevance of spiritual understanding and professional practice. There are so many ways that I could go with that, but I thought the most valuable way for me to explore that would be perhaps to share my own personal journey of how I found myself, not so many years ago now, being a transformational coach, and what I went through to get to that moniker in life. But I would say that this all kind of really began in my early 50s. And at that point, I would say, I would want to say that I was kind of at an all-time low. And George Pransky, who became my teacher at that time, George and Linda Pransky, George would say that he met me at a point where I was completely beaten up by life. And I would say that was very accurate. And I had spent most of my adult life being a professional photographer, and I'd had and I know that success is relative, but I had some significant success in that. But by the time we got to these shores, by the time we got to Los Angeles, that career was starting to wane. And this was at a point where we had two small children. I was finding myself in a situation where I really, I wasn't making enough money to make ends meet. And it was getting to the point where I needed to start thinking about, I need to find something else. I need to find a regular source of income. And although I had been through this program that USM offer, which many of the speakers here today have been through that program, I think that, I studied at USM and did their 2-year program in spiritual psychology. I think that for sure it was impactful and it was beautiful and had, I have so much that I want to say about that program that has just changed my life. But I think at the time, because of all that I was going through, I finished that program and my career as a photographer tanked. My marriage fell apart. We were hanging on by a thread. And I think that really, having gone through this program in spiritual psychology, I got a little bit cynical about all things that were spiritual. And yet, the irony of it all is that because my career as a photographer had really tanked at this point, I needed a job, and lo and behold, there was a job at USM, and I found myself taking this job. But really, truth be known, and maybe people will be kind of shocked to hear this. I think that I still kind of felt pretty jaded and a little bit cynical about all things spiritual. And yet here I was in this community that was espousing spiritual principles. But nevertheless, I felt, here I am, you know, setting up chairs in a conference room, and 10 years earlier I'm being flown to Tokyo to shoot a campaign for Vidal Sassoon on shoot. And for me it's kind of like, oh gosh, this feels like my ego has taken a real bashing here. So I think that I was depressed. I was beaten up by life, as George would say. I really had got to the point where I felt like, wow, I'm doing my retirement job 30 years too early. And this was kind of my life at this point in time. Thankfully, my dear and beloved wife, who had always been a seeker and was always trying to look for new levels of understanding, had come across the Prensky's, and there was this invitation that had been on the table while she was going through her apprenticeship with George and Linda, that I could come and do an intensive with her, up in La Conner in Washington State. And I had some resistance to this. And I think apart from anything else, it felt kind of a little bit weird to me that I might go and do an intensive with my wife, where I felt like, what, my wife is going to be my therapist? I didn't know anything about the principles. I didn't know anything about this understanding. I just assumed she was adding another string to her bow, that would improve her capacity to be a successful therapist. So I'm assuming this is going to be putting me in this situation where she's going to be my therapist, and then whoever's going to be there to aid and abet that process is just going to be there to do exactly that. So I had some resistance to do that. And to cut a long story short, because I know that time is brief and I want to get this all in, I found myself finally agreeing or acquiescing to this request, but having some reservations. But needless to say, the experience was incredible. It saved our marriage, no two ways about it. But it also sowed the seed inside of me that where my suffering was coming from was from my conditioning, my programming, my thinking. And I found myself really just enjoying what was being pointed to, although I probably didn't really understand it at the time. I loved Linda and George. I soon after this intensive found myself in their pro training, and I will never forget going through that pro training in February, and at the very end of the weekend, realizing that I had had this amazing time, and for all the seminars that I had been to previous to this, and I had been at a lot, I had to ask myself the question, wow, Angus, this seminar was extraordinary, and you found yourself paying avid attention to it from start to finish. My attention never wavered. And I would say it's pretty safe to say that I have a pretty sort of, my wife would say that I have ADHD, no two ways about it. I've never been officially diagnosed, but I'm sure that's my lot in life. And my attention has a tendency to waver. With this conference, I was there every step of the way. And at the end of it, I had to ask myself this question, why? And I think that the answer that came was that everybody who shared, and particularly the teachers, were sharing from their heart. They were sharing in this very sort of authentic way. And they were also sharing and pointing to spiritual understanding via story. So I found the stories so compelling, and I found the experience beautiful, and it just really touched my heart. So I think that in some way I felt like I finally found my community. These are individuals that really speak to me in a beautiful and simple way. And this understanding is just really resonating with me. So then this really funny thing happened. And this is certainly a point in my life where, yeah, I was starting to shift my mindset, and I was starting to be influenced by the principles. And I love what they were pointing to, and I love what these, and I loved how these teachers were pointing to it. But I still had this sort of probably ongoing depression that I'm still, here I am in my retirement job 30 years too early. I feel like life is not what it should be. And around about this time, pretty soon after that pro training, and I forget the year it was, but um, Rahini gets this invitation. I think at this point, Rahini has probably just finished her apprenticeship, but she gets this invitation to go to Oslo to be a part of this team, which is going to be spearheaded by Linda and George, to teach the principles to a group of, I guess, there were going to be two groups. There was going to be a group of business leaders, and then there was going to be a group who just wanted to learn about the principles. And Linda was going to spearhead the group for the newcomers, and George was going to spearhead the group for the business leaders. And so Rahini was invited to come along to be an assistant, I guess, and to be a part of this team. And then they invited me too. And I'm like, wow, these people, they're amazing. They're so generous. And this is like a weekend in Oslo. And, I mean, you can't look a gift horse in the mouth. I think that was my idea at the time. And I leapt at the chance. Wow, how amazing that they just, they're inviting me along. And I think, wow, they're so generous. Anyway, so we get there, and I remember I'll never forget this. It's a Friday night. We've flown in, and we've only flown in really for the weekend. And we fly in. It's a Friday night, and all of the mentees, as it were, the apprenticeships are all assembled in this room with George and Linda. George takes the team that he has decided he wants to work with, and then Linda has her team, and then Linda goes through this process of allocation about who's going to do what this weekend. And I think I want to say there are probably 6 to 8 mentees that were there. And I'm just hanging out. I'm just, standing there observing that this whole process unfold. And she separates the mentees into pairs, gives them their various tasks, and tells them that they're going to have to lead groups, that there's going to be a seminar, but we're going to do breakout groups, and you're going to lead the breakout groups. Pairs everybody up. And then she turns to me, says, Angus, I don't know what I'm going to do about you. I'll give you your own group to lead. And I'm like, I practically, I practically passed out on the spot. But nevertheless, this is, what could I say? I couldn't say no. And actually what I did, which is so funny, is that my boss at USM, who's this wonderful man, John Ruby, would always be given these tasks that felt so outlandish and so impossible to fulfill. And his reaction was always to smack his hands together, rub his hands together, and go, "That's so exciting." And I'd be like, "Really, John? Is it that exciting? Isn't that a lot of work for us to do?" But that's how he would roll. And I found myself channeling John Ruby and going, "That's so exciting," in front of all these mentees. And I'm given this job to lead a small group. So anyway, again, cut a long story short, the seminar, I think there's probably, I don't know, I want to say there's probably 100 people, maybe something around that number in the seminar with Linda. And then we're separated into small groups, and I have my group. And as I say, my ego does not like public speaking. So I think that a big part of me sharing this today is that really all I had to go on was my instincts and my intuition. If I'd had any kind of notice that this is what was going to be happening, I would have been an absolute wreck. But because it was so sudden and spontaneous, I didn't have too much time to get nervous. But the funny thing was that I led my small group, and I guess, trusting my instincts, I probably said some things that were valuable. But when we got back into the main room, a whole bunch of people from my group put up their hands to share and said, Angus said this and Angus said that. and what happened at dinner that night was that a lot of fun was being made of me, that, Angus is the rookie of the year, and it was Angus this, it was Angus that. And really, as I went through that experience, I think I was probably remembering what I had learned at USM and was using some basic skills to reflect back to these individuals that had in some way kind of landed. But what had landed is that I was trusting my intuition. I was trusting that past part of me that was wise. But I think that really what I want to say, and where I was at this particular time in my early 50s before I met the Pranskys, was that I had conflated wisdom with intelligence. And I did not think myself being a particularly intelligent soul or individual. I had a brother who, was a sort of like classic sort of the equivalent of an Ivy League student. I was an absolute train wreck at school. I did not succeed in that department at all. So by the time I got to a point where my career as a photographer tanked and I had to find something else to do, I don't have any credentials. What the hell am I going to do with my life? And so I think that was another reason why, you've just proven to yourself that, you're a little bit stupid. And I carried that thought for a good portion of my life. And, I had success as a photographer. By the time I failed in that endeavor, I was left with this feeling, look at you, Angus, you're an abject failure. And so for me, I feel like this was not something that I didn't give wisdom its due respect. And yet here I was in this community talking about wisdom being something that's innate within you. And it's something that's universal, and it's something that we all have access to. So I believe that what happened, obviously, in that moment, in that small group, is that I somehow was able to get into that intuitive mindset and offer something up of value. So I think that really, for me, this journey around following my wisdom began in a profound way. And I feel that this was a defining moment, because at dinner that night, George also invited me to consider becoming a mentee and going through the program. And this is something that felt like, yeah, you know what? I think on some level, my ego liked this. So my ego was kind of like, yeah, finally you can find something new to do. Finally, you can have a new path that maybe will bear some fruit in life. Um, but I think, and I agreed to do it, and we found a way to do it. And I found myself going up to the Pacific Northwest to learn with George and Linda. But I still had what I would say is this sort of lack of confidence. I had this imposter syndrome. Can I really do this? Is this something that's really possible? I never in a million years saw myself being a coach or anything in of that capacity. So this was a whole new terrain to me. And I think that my constant refrain with the Pranskys and with Rahini and everybody else is that I just don't know if I can do this. I don't have the credentials. And I think that the mantra that I heard from the Pranskys was that you just have to be yourself. You have to speak from your heart and tell your own story. And they just drilled that into my head. But it just was, I was such, I guess, here I am being that sort of quintessential poor student. I just couldn't hear that. I was so blocked around that possibility. And yet there was still this drive in me. It's like, yeah, but I still kind of love this. I love this community. I love this understanding. I really want to become a teacher. I really want to become a coach. But I had this general lack of self-confidence, this imposter syndrome, if you like. So anyway, so while I'm in the midst, I think, of doing this apprenticeship program with the Pranskys, Rahini and I were invited to be a part of this team that we're gonna teach a program in London. I think it was, I can't remember. I think it was over a weekend. It was 2 or 3 days. And I decided in my mind that I was going to use this as an opportunity to see how good I am. If indeed this works out, then perhaps I will consider becoming a coach. This will be kind of like the exam. It's exam time. I'm almost finished with the apprenticeship. Now I'm actually going to have to go and teach. And I remember sitting in the cab, driving over to the venue with Rahini and completely freaking out and saying to her, what am I going to do? I'm completely wet behind the ears. I have, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how to teach. What are we going to, and I literally, I was in a state of, I was just unraveling basically in the cab, which is probably the last thing that Rahini wanted to go through 10 minutes before we're going to have to get on stage and teach. And Rahini turns to me and in her infinite wisdom said to me, he said, Angus, all you have to do is show up and love these people. That's all that's required of you. Just focus on that and the rest of it will take care of itself. So I think I would have heard that in the past and my ego would be like, yeah, that's too far too woo-woo for me. But I was like, I'm gonna just have to trust her on this one. I'm gonna really have to trust her on this one. So we showed up and I just really found myself getting into this space, this mindset of just like projecting love to everybody that shared, whether it was the facilitator or one of the people in the program. I just focused on loving them. And I will never forget this. There was a guy on the first day, I guess had been around the block in terms of the principles and had been to a bunch of seminars before and was kind of questioning the format. And he was kind of vocal about that on the first day. But by the end of it, he got up and shared and he said, I don't know what you guys are doing, but whatever you're doing, keep it up. I've had incredible insights. The feeling in this room is beautiful. This is spectacular. And to me, wow, what an incredible validation that actually what Rahini was saying, what she was pointing to, yeah, this is all part of it. This is all part of my learning, realizing that wisdom and love are in this dance together. Maybe they're the same thing. And that was a real big turning point for me. But probably the biggest turning point came when towards, well, I guess it was at the end of my mentee program. Rahini and I were invited to be speakers, be what would you call it? Not speakers, MCs. That's the term that I'm looking for. We're invited to be MCs at the 3P conference that was going to be held in LA this time around. And I remember hearing that news and my ego got very inflated. I thought, wow, what an honor, how incredible. And I would go around telling people when they asked me what I'm doing of late, and says, "Yeah, I'm going to be emceeing the 3P conference," and I thought this was a really big deal. But I had been given I think about 6 months forewarning that that we were going to be doing this. And over the course of that 6 months, I would tell people what I was going to be doing, because I think my ego liked that. But the reply that I would get would be, "Oh, that's great. You'll be great. You're going to be really funny." And I'm like, "I'm going to be funny?" And in my mind, I was like, "Am I supposed to be funny? That's not my jam. I don't do funny." So my whole apprenticeship program had been so much about me focusing on being myself, speaking from the heart, being spontaneous. And I remember one particular weekend where the intensive was with a hotelier who was a president of this hotel company who'd been sent to George to sort of fix his nerves, as it were. And this guy's nerves were all about public speaking. And the whole weekend would be about George trying to share with him, you've got to speak from the heart. That's the only way to travel when you're working with people. Speak from your heart. So I had 6 months to think about doing this MC gig. And my ego was constantly, chattering away saying, you know what, this is too big a deal to speak from your heart. You've got to kind of like, and if you've got to be funny, you better write some material. So I spent months writing material, looking in my wing mirror in the car and reciting what I was going to say. And I was just getting more and more nervous until I finally got to the point where it was a week before the event, and I was literally getting no sleep. Every night I would go to bed and I would start going through what I was going to say. And this is like what I was thinking. This is insanity. It was like, it was a 3 or 4 day event. So what, I was going to like learn 4 days of material. but I would nevertheless go through this whole rigmarole of reciting the material in my head and not getting any sleep. And then there would always come this point where I would forget what comes next. And then I would imagine what it would be like on that stage at that venue, forgetting what comes next. And it would feel just terrifying. And I would literally have sleepless nights, but I had sleepless nights all of that week. And then I finally got to the night before and I resigned myself to the fact that I'm not going to sleep a wink. I'm going to be worrying about this all night. And I went through the original rigmarole of reciting my lines and forgetting what comes next. And then I had this moment at about 4 a.m. where I just suddenly asked myself, it was almost like I had George Pransky on my shoulder saying, what are you going to do about this? Is this working for you? And I had to ask myself a question: what would George say? And what George would say, the answer that came back is that you would speak from your heart. And for a moment, I entertained that, and in my capacity to entertain those words and imagine what that would be like, I completely settled and I got really quiet, and I got into this really beautiful feeling, but it wasn't strong enough to dull the panic in my ego that after about 30 minutes came back and said, but it's too late now. It's way too late now. You can't do that now. So I then found myself saying, yes, of course, that's right. I can't do that now. This is high stakes. I can't make a fool of myself in front of all these people. And then I got back into panic mode, and again, it was almost like I was getting into a point where I was having a panic attack. I hadn't had a panic attack for 30 years, but I was getting to that point. But thankfully, after another 30 minutes, George came back and it's like, you have to speak from your heart. So in that moment, that penny finally drops, and I realized, you know what? What have I got to lose? I can't remember. I was maybe 52 years of age. You've decided to take on board this endeavor. You decided to teach the principles. You've gone through this program. Why on earth wouldn't you listen to your teachers? Why would you just not really roll the dice and see what happens? What have you got to lose? And I said to myself, okay, well, you know what? If I crash and burn, that will be it. But I'm gonna pay heed to this advice. And I threw away all of the notes that I had created, the mental notes, pretty much. I decided to trash all of that material. And I made this decision. I'm going to speak from my heart. But as soon as I made that decision, I completely relaxed and completely settled. And the beautiful thing about that was I fell fast asleep immediately. Woke up in the morning. I'm still in this very settled state of mind. No nerves, no issues with this at all. I'm going to go and speak from my heart, get to the venue, pick up the mic, and that's what I did. I just basically spoke from my heart. I basically told the story that was probably a little bit more long-winded than I've just shared with you now, but I told this story and I talked about wisdom, and over the next 4 days, I spoke from that place. I spoke from that place of spontaneity, and what I now know fundamentally is that place inside of me that is universal, that place inside of all of us that is universal, that we are today calling wisdom. But I now know that that wisdom is in the same way that I conflated intelligence, my own personal intelligence, with wisdom. And that was part of my misunderstanding. That wisdom, I want to say today, is conflated with love. And that love and that wisdom, in the way that I work with my clients today, allows me to sit with anyone. So for spending years with this tremendous chip on my shoulder that I was less than, that I wasn't good enough, that I couldn't sit with people who I felt were my intellectual superiors. At this point of my life, none of that matters. The only thing that matters is that I get all that nonsense out the way and I tap into that field, which we are today calling wisdom. I would call love. It doesn't really matter what we call it. There is a field that I want to access, and that's where insight will come from. So when I work with clients, I mean, I've heard so many coaches say this. When I work with clients, I hear so many coaches say, I get so much out of it too. What happens, I feel, is that if I go into a coaching experience or I teach, hopefully there will come a moment where I can settle down enough and the client can kind of, and hopefully there's a reciprocity around that, where we can both settle down enough so that field can be accessed. And that's where insight emerges. And really, the beautiful thing about that is there's not really that much to do. And today, when I sit with people, and I am so blessed to be able to do the work that I do, and some of the people that I work with in the, some of the people I work with today who I may have worked with in the past, I would be, this guy is way, or this woman is way above my pay grade in terms of their intellectual smarts. I mean, I work with studio execs, I work with actors, I have people, clients who are in the aerospace industry. I have physicians. These are people who I would never thought that I could ever hold court with because of my limiting beliefs about where I am in my, my own personal intellect. That's not what's at stake. What's at stake is I trust that part of me that is intuitive, that part of me that is wise, that part of me that is universal, and I let that do the heavy lifting. All I have to do is hopefully let my ego sit back and watch this unfold. So today, when I say, the fear that I have about public speaking, that is my ego. That's all of my old conditioning and my programming. But the part of me that wise absolutely loves it because there's an opportunity to tap into something fresh and new. And when I can do that when I'm teaching, or I can do that when I'm sitting with a client, that is so exciting. And I feel so grateful to have found, for sure to have found USM, to be on that journey, but to have found the Pranskys, to have found the principles, to have found this community, and to found this way of being where there is this beautiful experience, like Bill, you said earlier. It's like we are this spiritual being having this human experience. And that spiritual being is having a ball playing this game of life. And that human being can also have a ball too, if it only allows itself to be led by that greater power, if you like. So I have been mindful of the time all along, and maybe I have been a little bit sped up in my delivery, but I think that kind of like neatly brings me to the 12:15 point where my dear beloved wife is now going to hop into this chair and share. But that's what I wanted to share today. And I just want to say I love you all. I love Shannon, and I love this life, and I love this experience.
Thank you so much, Angus. Thank you. So
You're so very
beautiful. I love
welcome.
hearing you share. Um, yeah, just thank you.
So I'm
Yeah.
going to tag my wife in.
Yeah.
All right.
Woo! While Rohini's getting settled, I want to share this thing came forward when Angus was speaking about when he was saying you call it wisdom, call it love, whatever you call it. And I was remembering I was in a ministerial program for a while, and the Reverend there, Reverend Michael Beckwith, he would say, call it love, call it God, call it wisdom. Who cares what you call it, but call it forth as the activity of your awareness.